Hello and what is up, YouTube? My name is G3Iron, and in today's 20th episode of our featured weekly build discussion series, we are taking a look at Dank's Crimson Bow Bleed Gladiator. If you've ever wanted to play a build that takes advantage of bleed explosions, take no further look than this particular bow-based gladiator that is going to have you exploding content just like you're seeing right here in a top-tier map in 3.10 Delirium League. Danka has put together a beautifully well-written forum guide that you can follow, including videos as well as pros and cons, a fully filled out path of building with both budget and endgame options, along with several other quality of life features in the build guide, such as an FAQ, as well as being an incredibly responsive and helpful community member. Danka does all of the things right when they are putting together their build guide, and worthy to be featured and discussed and used in all of the most up-to-date content that Path of Exile's got to offer. If you're new to the channel, welcome. You can go ahead and like, subscribe, and ding the bell to be notified about future video discussions just like this one. If you're a veteran of the channel, then you know the way how everything works around here. All of our sources, citation, including gameplay footage, if you'd like to go and view more of Danka's character in display in Delirium League, all of that helpful, wonderful links, including the path of building, will be included down below in the video description for your referencing convenience. Danka introduces the Crimson Bow Bleed Gladiator in this way. For the longest time, Bleed was in a rough spot, a mechanic that couldn't be used as a standalone. But is that still the case? Over time, new and more powerful toys were added to the game, stronger ascendancies, influenced items, fossils, and a new crafting system. After everything, Bleed finally became a force to be reckoned with. Some pros and cons of this particular build. First off, this build has got good clear speed, as you could just see it in the featured video that we just displayed, and it's also got some handy single target as well. It's quite tanky thanks to a mixture of dodge, evasion, as well as corpse removal and purity sentinels that act essentially as bodyguards to block various projectiles coming at you. It also provides bleed explosion popcorn sounds and is relatively cheap to get off the ground, meaning that if at this point in the league or at any point you'd like to league start this, or you're swapping over and joining a private league and you don't have much of a stash tab to work with, this is a great option for you to get your stash tab off the ground in a new league or in a private league. If you're a new player to Path of Exile, then this guide itself is going to be incredibly well written and will show you how to take this build from a basically solo self-found start to an endgame projection. Now, there are a couple of uniques that you're going to look for if you're looking for the ultra top-end versions of this build, but there are not any required uniques that are going to make this thing tick. You can self-craft this stuff all you want, or self-farm whatever it is that you're looking for in order to make this build shine. In terms of the life pool, we reached nearly 6,000 life, and while it's not quite hardcore viable, and I wouldn't personally recommend this for hardcore, it is very tanky due to the multiple layers of both offensive and defensive categories that you are putting at your disposal throughout your gameplay. Now, every week I have to highlight both the pros and the cons of every build, because builds do have drawbacks. And one of the things that we require out of builds that we're going to feature are that they're transparent and they let us know and let you know as a player, what are you walking into and what are maybe some of the drawbacks of the particular build. In this case, Danka lets us know that there are a few key items that get you off the ground and help speed you up. They're not necessarily required, but they are very, very helpful and can add massive amounts of quality of life. Maybe you don't like a particular skill in a build, and Danka lets us know that puncture might feel sluggish to some players. Also, the endgame gear for this particular build can get rather pricey as we are scaling up bleed and therefore physical damage, which a ton of different players are going to want in Trade League. And then lastly, if you're truly looking to minimize the hell out of this thing, then it can be quite hard to optimize this particular build. But again, there are so many builds like that in Path of Exile, and oftentimes there is a spectrum. If a build is generally easier to get going and get started on, then it's usually a bit tougher to get min-max towards the end of things. Vice versa, if something is usually tough to get started, then it might be a bit easier to min-max. That is a truism that holds true here for Danka's Bow Bleed Gladiator. Before we take a look at the endgame passive tree as well as the ascendancy of this particular build, I wanted to highlight how well this build is put together to be able to take you from a league start or from a character start all the way up and through maps. There is a beautifully well-written leveling progression guide that Danka has put together for us, including some gem progression guides. Oftentimes, newer players don't know when they can acquire certain gems. They're not sure what gem setups are optimal at different levels. And this particular leveling progression guide is going to show you exactly when to swap your setups to various different supports and to various different active gems. This is a wonderfully well-written portion of the guide. And if you're ever looking to put together a guide yourself, I would highly recommend that you take a look at this. There's a passive tree progression breakdown of what your passive tree ought to look like and what you ought to prioritize as you level up. There are gem level rewards as you continue to progress through the story. And then, of course, there's bandit rewards included right here in the leveling progression part. So if you're asking the question, which bandit do you take? Well, you should take Oak, that's recommended, or grab the 2 passive points. As if that wasn't detailed enough for you, there is an act-by-act guideline for walking you through playing this build in each and every act. If you are a new player and you have no idea how to play Path of Exile, you can take a look at this particular guideline in this particular write-up, even if you're not playing as a bow bleed gladiator. It's just a very, very helpful write-up with a lot of great information and a lot of great tips to get you progressing through the game quickly, and to have this on tap as either a bookmark page pulled up on your phone or pulled up on an additional screen or even just in the background as you're leveling can be incredibly helpful if you're new to Ray class in Path of Exile and don't know where to go next. Danka recommends that we play as a gladiator, and there's a couple of reasons for this. One of them is Outmatch and Outlast. This gives us a 25% chance to gain a frenzy charge on kill with our main hand, a 25% chance to gain an endurance charge on kill with offhand. Also gives 10% more physical damage while at maximum frenzy charges. Recognize that that is a more multiplier. Then we get an additional 10% reduced physical damage taken while at maximum endurance charges. Because we're not dual wielding, we are a bow user, we don't necessarily care about the top 2 parts of this ascendancy, but the more physical damage that we have, as well as the reduced physical damage taken, those are both incredibly efficient nodes for any build and make this a wonderful option for us as we are playing in Gladiator. Arena Challenger gives us more attack speed and movement speed per Challenger charge. We're going to stack up those Challenger charges up to a maximum of plus 10 with 25% chance to gain a Challenger charge when you hit a rare or unique enemy while in Blood Stance. This is also going to give us gain a Challenger charge when you kill an enemy while in Sand Stance. Whether you're in Blood Stance or Sand Stance is going to depend on whether or not you want to pump out more damage or play a bit more defensive. But we'll talk about that more in a few moments when we look at the gem setups. This is, of course, a bleeding build, and so we want to make our enemies bleed as much as possible. Nobody makes me bleed my own blood. Well, that's not what monsters are going to be saying anyway, at least while we're playing this. Blood in the Eyes gives us attacks have 25% chance to cause bleeding. Also, attacks maim on hit against bleeding enemies. In case you're unaware about being maimed, maimed enemies have reduced movement, and then because of Blood in the Eyes, enemies who are maimed also take 10% increased damage, which also acts as a more multiplier. There is a ton of damage built in to our ascendancy as long as we're able to make our target monster bleed. With Gratuitous Violence, we will have another 25% chance for our attacks to cause bleeding. Then we'll get 30% increased damage with hits and ailments against bleeding damage, which, yes, that does count towards bleeding damage. And then bleeding enemies you kill will explode, dealing 10% of their maximum life as physical damage. And then lastly, we get 25% more damage with bleeding. There are a lot of ascendancies and a lot of different tricks in Path of Exile to making stuff explode, and that explosion dealing damage. Generally, you're looking at different ratios and different tiers, but usually 1.5% is what you're looking for explosion damage off of items, about 3 to 5% maybe if it's a top tier item. Even some ascendancies, 5% is the maximum amount of explosions that they've had available to them throughout the lifetime of Path of Exile. Gratuitous Violence allows you to take 10% of a monster's HP and make them explode for that amount of damage to the entire pack around them. This is one of the reasons why in the featured video, as we were looking at gameplay, you'll see as soon as one monster in a pack dies, the entire pack dies. Gratuitous Violence is simply for bleed builds. Speaking of bleeding, you're going to want to take Bloodletting ASAP as you are leveling and getting yourself set up to transition into dealing most of your damage either via bleeding itself or supported by the fact that your enemies are going to be bleeding. Bloodletting is by far the furthest section of the tree away on either extreme, so you're going to want to go and either choose to pick this up early or choose to pick this up late. This is going to be the extreme side of your tree. Oftentimes, as you're building your passive tree, you're going to want to make a decision rather soon. Are there any particular key notables that I need to pick up as soon as possible, or are these particular notables that I can pick up later on down the road once I transition into a late game version of my build? Whenever you choose to go full on bleeding for your damage, that's when you want to make your way towards bloodletting. Enough about making stuff bleed. Let's talk about how we're going to prevent ourselves from bleeding and stay alive. We're going to take acro and phase acro. Those are both going to be very, very key defensive layers for this build. You can see on this particular POB, he's got a total of 6,100 life. And then also in terms of the total amount of evasion that he's got nearly 17,000 evasion. That means that he's got roughly a 54-ish% chance to evade attacks. That is a whole bunch of evasion rating. On top of that, he's got 40% chance to dodge attacks and 30% chance to dodge spells. Taking a look at Danka's suggested gem setups, your main skill is going to be Rain of Arrows, preferably Vol Rain of Arrows. That is the ability that as you are moving along, it looks as though your character fires up a whole bunch of arrows into the sky and they rain down destruction on whatever enemies were unfortunate to be underneath that cloud of death. For your support gems for Rain of Arrows, you're going to want to use Chance to Bleed support. This is pretty obvious. We get a whole bunch of flat added physical damage. Along with that, more chance to cause bleeding and more damage with bleeding. Alongside this, we're going to use Brutality support. A lot of players underrate Brutality, and they simply read that skills deal no chaos damage, skills deal no elemental damage, and especially newer players look at that and think, well, I want to scale up those other forms of damage. Path of Exile oftentimes rewards you for specializing in one particular thing and then focusing the heck out of it. Bleed skills are no exception, and in this particular case, we don't want to deal any chaos damage, we don't want to deal any elemental damage. All we want is physical damage because our bleed is going to scale off of that physical damage, and Brutality support is the single best physical support gem in the game. Now, as soon as I say that, somebody's going to say, yeah, but what about Awaken Brutality support? Anyway, moving on. Deadly Ailments is another great support gem for us because it gives us more damage with ailments. That's right, each of our bleed instances is going to be doing more damage thanks to Deadly Ailments support, and then we are also going to have increased damage over time. This is all quality of life for all of our various bleeds that we inflict upon our targets. Vicious Projectiles is a bit of a strange one. If you're just reading it for the first time, you might think, oh, well, there's more chaos damage over time on here, but we're not doing chaos damage over time because of Brutality, so why would we pick that? That seems strange, right? Well, once again, in terms of the numeric value for scaling physical bleeds, there is not going to be much that can compete with Vicious Projectiles for the more physical damage over time that is going to be added through this particular gem as a support to any bleeding build that is going to use projectiles. Your sixth and final link is going to be Maim support, which increases the chance that you are going to maim your targets and also increases the amount of damage that your targets take because they are maimed. Puncture is going to be our single target skill, and it's a bit different. The reason why we're going to want to use this for a single target skill rather than using, let's say, for instance, Rain of Arrows, is simply because we are going to automatically cause our bleeding debuff with Puncture, and it's going to focus all of its damage into a single projectile rather than worrying about spreading it out. Rain of Arrows gives you good coverage for AoE for taking out packs. Puncture gives you great damage for single target bosses who are in your way. Our support gems are going to look identical to what Rain of Arrows are going to look like, and with one exception. We want to use Chance to Bleed, Brutality, Deadly Ailments support, Vicious Projectiles, and then the one exception, we want to use Unbound Ailments support. The reason for Unbound Ailments is simply that it gives us an increased duration of ailments on enemies and then also gives us more effect and more damage onto the enemies that are hit by it. Because we are scaling up Bleed as our primary source of damage against single target bosses, Unbound Ailments gives us the best amount of damage for the slot available for a single target option on Puncture. Now, Danka points out that we need to be using Ensnaring Arrow along with Barrage support for bossing. And the reason for this is that Ensnaring Arrow is going to make slowed enemies always take 200% more damage from bleeding. Now, that normally only happens while an enemy is moving, but there are tons of different bosses inside Path of Exile who don't count as moving. One great example of it that you might think of would be Kitava. Kitava almost never counts as actually moving throughout all of his various animations. So the only way to get Kitava to essentially take that more multiplied damage from having all of these stacked up bleeds is by using Ensnaring Arrow, which makes it so that way he's always going to count as moving for the purposes of calculating your bleeds, which means even immobile or stationary bosses aren't going to be able to resist the amount of damage that you are going to place on them and inflict through bleeding. Two quick notes about auras and about reservation of mana. You need to choose one aura that you're going to use, whether that's Grace, Malevolence, or Pride. The trick here with each of these are that they're each going to come with their own trade-offs and their own bonuses. Of course, Grace is going to grant you extra evasion, but when you've got the amount of evasion that's already stacked on the character later on and into higher tier maps, it's simply going to fall off for its effectiveness. Malevolence is great, and Danka recommends that you use it, especially if you can combine it with a Watcher's Eye mod. And Pride, of course, is just your straight up best bonus for damage. Of course, Pride requires you to be in a relatively tight circle with the enemies that you are hitting, so it's great for when you're fighting against bosses or even packs that you want to get relatively up and close and personal with. But the drawback to that is you might not want to get up and close personal because you are a bow build, you don't have very much mitigation built in, and you're primarily relying on not getting hit in order to avoid damage. For stacking offensive and defensive options with our mana, we also want to use Herald of Purity, which grants us a bunch of flat extra physical damage, as well as providing us with a little bit of a defensive option since the ghosts that are summoned through the Herald of Purity, those sentinels do act as body blockers for various projectiles that otherwise might hit us. And of course, we can use Blood and Sand to either be in Sand Stance or in Blood Stance, either for adding some extra defensive layers to ourselves through Sand Stance, or through adding some extra damage by being in Blood Stance. I had mentioned earlier that there are a couple more expensive kind of top-end items that you can be looking for as you are building out this build. And of course, one of them is Feral's Fur. Depending on the league, Feral's Fur can range from anywhere to be incredibly expensive to being moderately expensive. The big deal for Feral's Fur is, of course, that it gives you both armor and evasion along with life, and grants you the fact that Aspect of the Cat reserves no mana. If you're unfamiliar with Aspect of the Cat, or were wondering, well, why the heck do I want to roleplay as a cat? Here's the reason why. While active, it grants you Cat's stealth and Cat's agility buffs in sequence. In other words, it bounces between each of these every 4 to 6 seconds respectively. Cat's stealth increases your critical strike chance and makes you harder to see and gives you a chance to avoid damage for a short duration. Cat's agility, on the other hand, increases your attack and cast speed for a longer secondary duration. So Aspect of the Cat and using Feral's Fur makes it so that way we don't need to reserve any mana in order to use these rotating buffs as they bounce back and forth and as they toggle between giving us more survivability and more damage. The second big unique that you're on the lookout for is Reslatha's Coil. This particular belt is fantastic for physical-based builds because it gives you a whole bunch of stats that you need. It grants you some flat physical damage to your attacks, it grants you strength, it grants you maximum life, and then it also grants you these two very uniquely worded mods that oftentimes new players miss out on the value. First, it grants you more maximum physical attack damage. That one's pretty simple. It's giving you more damage, which is good. More in Path of Exile acts as a multiplier, so things that say more damage versus added damage simply act as a multiplier along the chain of counting your damage, adding everything else up, and then getting multiplied at the end of it. In Path of Exile, this is of course referred to as multiplicative damage versus additive damage. So it's pretty simple, right? It grants more physical attack damage. Sounds like a good belt. But that's only partially where the value of this particular belt comes in. The second unique line that really confuses a lot of players is it gives you less minimum physical attack damage dealt. In other words, when you do an attack in Path of Exile, you roll a particular amount of stats on that particular attack. Let's say, for instance, for the sake of this particular Reslatha's Coil, which gives you a random number between 1 to 18 for your physical attacks. That means that when you attack, this particular belt is adding anywhere between 1 to a maximum of 18 physical damage to your attacks. Well, by using the less minimum physical attack damage statement, this essentially bumps up the lower end of what damage you could have rolled to a much better value. This means that instead of having a much wider spectrum of damage that your build could have been doing, you're actually much closer to doing your top end amount of damage that your build is potentially able to pump out. You're essentially rolling worse numbers less by using Reslatha's Coil, which brings your average damage way up. Two last quick things as we wrap up today's featured build discussion. First off, there is a beautiful, glorious crafting section on how to build your bleeding bow, whether you're in SSF, if you're in Trade League, or if you're just league starting and you want to craft all of your own gear to begin with. You can take a look at the crafting section. It is wonderfully put together and I highly recommend it for you. Also, there's this beautiful FAQ section, which as players interact and ask questions and play this build, they send those in to Danka, and Danka has done a great job of updating this build, interacting with questions, and then compiling those questions into an FAQ. So if you're playing this particular build and you've got a question about how things operate, chances are somebody else might have had a similar question along the way, and you can check the FAQ rather than checking through 60 different pages of forum posts to find out what the answer to that question might be. Well, thank you so much for coming and joining us today for our 20th featured build discussion. I really appreciate each and every week that everybody contributes their own ideas, their own contributions, their own suggestions for each of these builds. So if you've got any ideas, suggestions, or even feedback based off of similar builds that you've tried out, or maybe you've inadvertently created something that's often very times similar to this particular build, feel free to drop us a comment down below and let us know what your experience is playing similar base builds. If you're trying this build out for yourself and this channel or this discussion was where you found out about this build, feel free to let us know down below in the comments how that build is progressing for you in whatever league or whatever form it is that you're playing, hardcore, softcore, trade, or solo self-found. Thanks once again for watching, and I hope today is the day a Mirror of Galandra drops for you. Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.